This is Liz Varga. I come to you from Columbus, Ohio, and I'm excited to give you a little background into my counseling career and how I went from clinic to industry and back again. So I am going to keep this informal, just like it's a conversation where I'm telling you a little bit about myself and my career journey. And I would just encourage you to take notes in a way that's most helpful for you, pull out the salient points. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is just who I am as a person, because I think one of my key messages I want to have you leave with today is kind of understanding yourself and determining your best fit career path. So from my standpoint, I graduated from the University of Cincinnati Genetic Counseling Program in 2002. I did my undergraduate degree in biological sciences at DePauw University in Greencastle, Indiana. And I decided that I wanted to be a genetic counselor pretty early on. I was actually in AP biology in my high school, which was an all-girls school, Ursuline Academy in Cincinnati, Ohio. And we did actually a field trip where we went to a zoo, and the zookeeper was actually talking about careers in genetics and how you could use different skills that you have in order to find a best fit career path. I think I knew early on that I loved the problem solving and complexity of science. I was always interested in it, but I also needed it to be applied in a people-centric way. I always loved interacting with people. So genetic counseling sounded like a good fit. And so I explored that further throughout my undergrad. I did both lab, bench work, also did a study abroad program where I spent time at a medical center in London and got exposure to genetics from the lab side again. And then I did a 1 month rotation with the University of Cincinnati Genetic Counseling Program as an undergrad and got exposure to genetic counseling and genetics in general, medical genetics. So I actually left that rotation thinking I wanted to be an MD geneticist. However, I would say that as that time grew closer, I started to realize I didn't want to give up my 20s and deal with the stress of graduate school and the financial, medical school and the financial commitment of all of that. And I also knew about myself that I wanted to have work-life balance, have a family. And so I didn't want work to own me. So I basically selected genetic counseling and I went right out of undergraduate into my graduate program. So then when I started the program, I was pretty open in terms of what I thought I would want to do with my degree. Um, you have to remember that I graduated over 20 years ago, and so the options were much more limited then than they are now. Industry jobs were starting to become a thing, but it was very, very rare for a genetic counselor to go into industry, especially as a first position out of school. So going into my program, at the time, there were really only three main domains: cancer, pediatrics, and prenatal. Of course, there were some things emerging like pharmacogenomics and infertility genetic counseling. There were starting to be some subspecialty areas, but nothing like it is today. So I had kind of a seminal event that occurred right before my starting of training, which was that I had a family history of blood clots, and one of my my mother was tested for factor V Leiden thrombophilia, found to be positive, and at the time it was pretty new. It was only discovered in like 1996, and this was about 2000, and so it was recommended by my primary care physician that I have genetic testing for that. I was positive for a heterozygous variant, and at the time, the recommendation was to completely stop birth control, which didn't seem like a big deal, but I was on it for even non-birth control reasons, and so that kind of led to a lot of issues for me medically. And then I was also surprised as I was starting my training as a genetic counselor, how little education I was given about factor V Leiden. And at the time, there was not great information available on the internet, or really through like other resources or support groups. So all of that became defining for me. And I ended up doing my thesis research on knowledge and education needs of people with factor V Leiden. I collaborated on that project with a professor from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I loved that research. And he really paved a way for a lot of early things in my career, including opening doors to public health. So he actually presented my work at the for Disease Control and Prevention because he was involved in activities with CDC. And that was exciting because as a graduate student, they were hearing about my work. And that opened a lot of doors for me personally, where I ended up forming an advocacy organization a few years after my graduation and actually had part of my salary paid by CDC. And so I really thought I was going to be headed on more of a public health direction, if anything. So my first career choice, I actually was restricted in terms of geographic area. So my husband is an immigrant from Venezuela, and he had been sponsored through visas through his school during our dating years. And he needed sponsorship for his first job as an engineer. And that ended up being in Kansas City, Missouri. So I agreed to move out there and take whatever job was available. The job market was very limited in Kansas City at the time. So I ended up really, there was nothing when I was first looking, and something magically opened right at the right time. And I took a job as a maternal fetal medicine counselor. I was the only one in that clinic, and it was a high risk clinic for sure. It was not routine indication. So almost everything was like an ultrasound anomaly or an abnormal. We did have abnormal screenings that I counseled, but it really pushed me as a new graduate because I had to figure out a lot on my own. Um, and again, I at this point was only like 23. I didn't have kids. So it was a lot to take on as a new grad, but I really loved that. And my coworkers were really like family. What caused me to leave that position was primarily location. I wanted to come back to Ohio to be closer to family. And also, at the time in Kansas, there were a lot of movements that were pro life, including the medical students at my university and medical center that were very like pro life, and they would show aborted fetuses and things like that. And there were certain things that made me feel uncomfortable in the work environment that I decided to move on. So my next position, about 2.5 years later, was at an academic medical center in Ohio. So I moved to that medical center, and they actually were perfect timing creating a job that was non-cancer. It was supposed to focus on growing service lines like cardiology. And they actually recruited me specifically due to my background in the field of hematology. They didn't have a good sense of what this program would look like. So the first year or so of my job, I was just introduced to physicians in hematology or other adult service lines like pulmonology. I was added to research projects that were being done in those areas that any of the local investigators had going on. And pretty much there was no recipe. I was just supposed to grow the service. So I really actually loved that job. But as happens in academia, the person who recruited me got recruited away herself 6 months later. So she actually relocated. And so when that occurred, that led to a lot of changes within the department, and also a little less support or guidance in terms of the new program we were developing. And so I was starting to have to see more cancer indications, and many of my colleagues were very like nationally renowned in the cancer space. And so that just wasn't my first love. I knew I personally do have a very strong family history of cancer, and it was just like too personal to watch people my age. I had a really hard time separating myself in that role. So I knew that I would not excel in a cancer setting. That was not what I wanted to do in terms of adult cancer. So I ended up leaving that position when a new role in the same city of Columbus opened up at the Children's Hospital there. And my friend, actually, who had also left the same university to go to the Children's Hospital, she had actually kind of been keeping an eye out for me. And a geneticist was creating a new role in autism genomics research. And so when that opportunity became available, I was just approached for that and hired. And that was a complete shift. I had never really thought about autism genomics, but this was at a time where exome sequencing was just starting to really move into the realm of possibility. And I was excited by the opportunity. Again, at this point, we really didn't have standard genetics workups for autism. We didn't know the value of exome. It was very experimental at this time. And so I was enrolling multiplex families. And I also had really cool opportunities to work in conjunction with Department of Defense. So I would get to go to an Air Force base to do recruitment. We won a large grant and contract, which was why the job became available. And so I again loved the fact that there was no cookbook. It was kind of like go find ways to find patients, go to local autism organizations, work with different clinics, go to the base, and then create the study from scratch, including even the database, which at the time they signed me up for a class so that I could learn database design to build our research database. So I just took all that in stride and I did that for about 5 years. And I actually really did love that role as well. But an opportunity again arose. And back in my university hospital days at the adult facility, I had networked with the pediatric hematologists in the children's hospital. And the goal of that networking was because it was the end goal was to grow our program indirectly because we knew they were identifying children with thrombosis and thrombophilia predisposition. And we wanted to care for their adult patients at the university level. And so I had forged those collaborations. As I mentioned, I had also developed an advocacy group that we were conducting workshops across the country. I was getting more of a national name. I was able to publish a lot in the field. I was attending a lot of meetings where like hematologists were. So through those connections, the Children's Hospital hematologist got to know me. And one day he texted me actually and said, we've been loaning out a genetic counselor through the genetics department, but we're actually interested in creating a role. Would you consider moving over to hematology? So that led to some discussions, and they did create that role, again, built from scratch, where there had never been a genetic counselor embedded in the hematology oncology division in pediatrics. So I started with some low-hanging fruit, including counseling sickle cell disease and hemophilia and thrombophilia, but that did not fill my time. And so at the time, there was also new knowledge coming about regarding genetic predisposition for pediatric patients to cancer. So I started to mimic some other clinics that I was seeing in the genetic counseling field where they were evaluating survivors of pediatric cancer, doing family histories, and in some cases offering genetic testing for select syndromes. So I started to build a long-term follow-up or survivorship cancer predisposition program. And as you can imagine, as the literature evolved, there became more and more demand. And so eventually that program expanded to allow for development of a cancer predisposition clinic. So my role quickly expanded over time to do both hematology and oncology. I was able to recruit another genetic counselor, and I was able over time to get recruited or promoted to the co-director of the personalized medicine program at the children's hospital that I was in. So this was a great, career opportunity over time for me. I was in that role for 9 years in various iterations. So again, I did have the opportunity to grow. I ended up getting essentially two promotions during my time in that role. And one thing in that role that occurred was that during the time, we also had the opportunity to recruit new people from the outside to develop a genomics and Institute for Genomic Medicine program. So this was very exciting. This was where it was starting to become a time where foundation medicine was emerging, or other companies that were offering like tumor genomic profiling. And St. Jude was working on the pediatric cancer genomics project along with Washington University in St. Louis. So I actually explored some other jobs and thought about leaving my institution to pursue new opportunities in this genomic space. And I actually got offers for those jobs and used that to counter at my children's hospital, which then they did counter and I ended up staying. And part of that commitment was that they wanted me to help grow genomics within pediatric hematology oncology once they had more of the resources available in terms of leadership. So in 2016, we did recruit those leaders. They built a genomics institute. They were really given a lot of resource to do this, so a lot of equipment, a lot of funding for bioinformatics staff and the whole infrastructure, things like a lab vantage system to allow specimen tracking, just lots of funding. So that was really a great opportunity. So in 2017, um, I was still in my clinical role, and the Institute for Genomic Medicine wanted to develop their protocol to sequence pediatric oncology patients and offer them tumor and normal exome sequencing as a comparator test, things like transcriptomics, and eventually methylation testing. So I actually spoke with the head of the Genomics Institute and kind of made the case for why I should be involved in that protocol development and implementation, and was able to kind of morph my role so that about half of my FTE was funded on this genomics project. And so that was exciting. I loved being part of that group to form the protocol and implement it, really bringing the latest cutting edge technology to patients at the bedside. However, I would say where I was naive is that, even though I was able to get part of my position funded, there were still similar demands on the hospital side. And it's not like my patients just went away. So I still had similar demands. I was hoping that there would be more resource for a genetic counselor or a GCA. But over the span of 2 to 3 years, there were no more FTEs given in that department. And so eventually I primarily burnt myself out. In retrospect, it's like, yeah, no kidding. Like, I don't know who I think I was, taking on basically, enrolling about 100 patients a year in very critical acute situations. We would try to approach them as close to diagnosis as possible. I first got involved more heavily in neuro-oncology at that time, as I mentioned earlier, from an emotional standpoint, cancer is hard for me. I love it, especially peds. I do have a soft spot for it, but I think I totally underestimated the change in my role and how that would emotionally affect me. And then also at this point in my life, I had had 3 children. And so I was balancing demands at home, lack of sleep, all of those things. And after year of putting more staff in the budget and it being denied in terms of support and just being in a role for 9 years, certain frustrations anywhere you work will continually recur. And so I got to a point where I was just really, really burnt out. And it was some colleagues in the field who gave me really good advice. I still remember one colleague, she said that before she made a leap, she had read an article about like how to leave a job you love over and over and over. And she sent me that article, and I read that article, and I was like, that's exactly where I am. I have a job I love, but I just can't sustain this anymore. I'm losing myself and I'm exhausted, and it's not really worth it. And I've done multiple things to force issues. I've gotten successfully promoted, but it's not enough. It's not about the money really anymore. I need to reclaim myself. I remember having the thought, like, I just want time to think. I have no time to think. And that was really the time where I was like, huh, something has to change. So coincidentally, I had been talking to my supervisor for a couple of years about resources. That was no surprise. I had also been talking about my frustrations openly. There had been times where tears had come out. There had been times where I had applied for other jobs and told my supervisor I may be leaving. I had even explored some industry jobs, but never ended up taking that leap at the time, mostly because they would involve like relocation. And I just wasn't quite sure because I still really did see myself as an academic and I loved things like teaching students. But again, at some point, the burnout became the driving um, part of the equation for me. So coincidentally, what I actually was contacted by a headhunter. So those of you not familiar, a headhunter will look you up on LinkedIn or are hired by different firms to try to recruit genetic counseling candidates. And so I was approached about an industry role, and it was one called a genomic testing consultant, where it's kind of a hybrid, I would say, between being a sales representative and a medical science liaison. So the medical science liaisons are more unbiased instructors of information. They provide the medical data and they consult with clinicians to try to educate them on the background of their product. Whereas the sales consultant is much more based on metrics and sales and generating new business or maintaining previous business. So it was a hybrid role, and it didn't require a lot of travel. It was one where I was expected to just cover the state in which I lived, of Ohio. And so most of the travel would be drivable and maybe only require an overnight stay per week. And then otherwise, the schedule was pretty flexible because it was based on your sales calls that you were expected to generate. Maybe things like attendance at conferences to work the booth, etc. And then like things like the national sales meeting, but it was not a lot of travel, so it seemed to be conducive to my home life. Um, Again, part of my rationale for making a switch was that I felt not as engaged in my children's lives as I wanted to be, so it offered that flexibility. That was also appealing because I felt that I was offloading a lot of parental responsibility to my husband at the time, so I loved the idea of the flexibility it would give me. Then it came down to interviewing, which went well. I really liked the people that I interviewed with. I actually knew some people in the company at the higher levels who I had served on committees with. So I had a good feel about the company. I also then ultimately, like, the headhunter was amazing. So one thing to be aware of, the headhunters are there to like have a good fit and make your experience as good as possible. They did a great job. And so they made me feel very good about accepting this role. And then when it came to the offer, the salary, just the base salary, was about 50% more than what I was making. Plus things that were huge benefits, like a company car with totally supplied gas for the car, even for your personal use. Also, the opportunities for bonuses and commission payments. And the commissions were guaranteed in the role I took for 1 year. So after that, you'd be expected to kind of pull in your commissions, but during the transitional phase, that was guaranteed as well. So the package was just really something I just felt like I could not turn down. And given all the other factors in my role, I decided it was definitely worth taking that chance. So I switched jobs right before I switched in February of 2019, I think it is. But if you remember that year, there was a big impact. No, maybe it was 2020. 2020, I think, actually. Big impact because COVID started the month later. So I switched jobs, and 6 weeks later is when everything started to be shut down for the coronavirus pandemic. And so, what I had had the opportunity to do in the first 6 weeks of my new role was that I had been able to go to the national sales meeting. So I did meet all of my colleagues. It was about a week long training. Um, we got to talk lots of strategy. I learned more about the company at large, which it was a very large company. One thing I was looking for was stability. I was very, very nervous to go to a company that didn't have a strong track record and might not be financially viable. And so what I went to was a genomics division of a large global company. So they had many other products too. And they had over the years made many acquisitions of other industry areas. So that was really cool because I was exposed to this global experience. Things even about my onboarding that I remember being so impressed about were like I had a vacation planned in Florida right before I switched jobs, and I could just go. They would send me a list of places where I could go to get like my drug screen, and it was just like call them up, done, do it there. I could like apply for my car from a computer. When I did the onboarding training, it was all like really impressive graphics, and I was just blown away. I just remember being like, what have I been doing in like academia for so long? Like there's all this new world out here. It's so impressive. And then I just felt really taken care of, if I'm going to be honest, when I was leaving a job of burnout to go somewhere where like unlimited food and drinks are supplied, and you just feel very welcomed and you feel very like appreciated. And I remember having a feeling of kind of like, I've made it now. Like I've made it. This is really nice to feel so respected. And I felt like I was very well treated by my manager and things like that. Um, so in the beginning weeks, things went pretty well, but obviously coronavirus threw a whole new, factor in the mix, and we all were adapting. The sales force then was not able to travel nearly as much, and I had only done maybe like 2 or 3 sales calls with my manager prior to the pandemic halting all travel. So we basically were working remotely with different projects that we're trying, to maybe like update marketing materials or help the lab with various things in terms of genomic interpretation. So they definitely kept us busy, and my team was great, like all of the other consultants I worked with. But one thing that was interesting in industry for me was that as a consultant, only some of them were genetic counselors. Others had more traditional like sales trainings or MSL backgrounds. So definitely it was exposure to me regarding the different types of backgrounds people had. I think the other thing I realized is like I had never really thought about business structure that much. So things that are like so understood in industry, like there's a marketing department, there's a sales department, like how the leadership hierarchy goes, like, okay, manager, director, VP, senior director, senior VP, like I just didn't know any of those things going in. So I remember kind of being like, wow, there's all these things I don't really know about how a business operates. And I loved being exposed to that and learning that. Um, but some of the things that I started to realize that were different for me was that I was so used to a collaborative environment. And I still remember some things like being challenged by others in the company, like, wow, you're so generous with your time and helping your colleagues like find leads. If I had colleagues who I knew genetic counselors, for instance, in their territory and not mine, I would take it upon myself to introduce them and try to help them. And that was kind of like thought of as almost like odd. Like, why would you do that? They're your competitor, sales rep. You guys are kind of compared to each other. And what I didn't really realize about sales is that, this varies by company, but it's pretty common that you are compared openly. There's annual awards for like top salesperson. And so that creates a little bit of a jockeying and a competitive feeling with your coworkers. And some people, especially the genetic counselors, I think still had more of a collaborative spirit, but then others that were sales backgrounds, it's naturally just their mindset, right? To try to move up the ladder, be the best. You were also incentivized with not only money, but things like trips. So winning that sales competition would get you a President's Club award or a trip. And so just things I was just not used to. And so that was interesting to perceive. Um, and then the other thing I did not anticipate is things like how this would change my relationships. So I was covering Ohio, mostly pediatric institutions. So these were all my colleagues. I had lived in Ohio a long time. So I expected my friendships to be maintained and actually the same. And that was naive because then when I started to reach out to my friends, even to just have coffee or drinks, it's like, why are you doing that? Like, are you gonna try to sell me something? I don't know. Like, I could no longer like buy a gift for my friend because it might be perceived as a conflict of interest. Or like, if I want to pay for your dinner, that's a conflict of interest. Or like, why am I going on site to the hospital? Is it to visit my friend or is it to do a sales role? So that became very challenging for me. Because I felt like it interrupted my friendships or like the perception of my motives. And that was kind of unsettling for me. I also underestimated, I've always had a very strong social media presence. And things like about my social media, uh, even sharing simple things from my standpoint, like my son's allergist, he's very open on social media. And at one point, he had posted something on why food sensitivity kits are inaccurate. And I retweeted his post. And um, come to find out, like, even though it was totally unbranded what he had tweeted, my company ended up wanting to speak with me about that tweet because they actually had a different division. It wasn't even related to my work that worked on food sensitivity kits. And that was a large part of the company revenue. And so they, approached it in just, wanting to learn more about the provider's hesitations and wanting to talk to me about like maybe the value and make sure I understood the value. And that ended up kind of causing friction even with my own allergist, because I would talk to him about stuff like that and ask him questions. And so just to feel watched for me, like my Twitter is not even my own, even when it has nothing to do with actually the product I'm selling, that I could not handle. There were other things that came up, like some media reports during my time at the company that were a bit concerning or, questioned. Yeah, I don't want to go into details about that, but there were some things that occurred that made me just feel like this was not the right role or fit for me. So I decided within 6 months that I wanted to leave that industry role. The way I did that was I actually just switched my LinkedIn to open to work hashtag. And you can make it so that it's private to your own employer, supposedly. And I was pretty immediately contacted by a few different people, but the one that caught my interest was at a small tech company. They were beyond the startup phase, I would say. They had about 30 employees and they had been in business for several years and they had a growing um, customer base. And they were selling a product that does genomic interpretation. Well, I should take that back. It's like a search engine for the medical literature, specifically as related to genomics. And so their product helped to find full text articles. So you could search like gene, variant, phenotype, copy number, even drug therapeutic information. And you could put these like key terms or even like loss of function. Tell me everything about all the loss of function variants. So it was a very cool database and it was utilized primarily by laboratories that do genomics testing, and it was also an international client base. So they had many customers outside the country. So I was exposed to like Australia, Brazil, etc. So when I was approached about that job, it was a new job they were creating called Director of Customer Success. They had never had one before. And it would be on the senior leadership team, and I would report exactly directly to the CEO of the company. And so it was a very grueling interview process. It was over several days, meeting with several people. And one was a multi-hour interview with the CEO and the VP of sales. And I was just very authentic in myself. I didn't feel like desperate at that time, but I loved how intellectual the company was. Like it really appealed to my intellect. I was very excited about like AI and machine learning that they were developing, some natural language processing tools. And I knew that I did want to engage with customers. So it was just all seemed to be a very good fit. So I started with them. It was a fully remote role. I worked from my home. They were based in Michigan. And unfortunately, due to COVID, I was never able, in the entire time I worked for them, I was never able to meet anyone in person. So it was an interesting experience. I learned so much about startup mentality and just the nature of it. So whereas I was coming from either academia or large corporate life, this was very scrappy in the sense that like you're sent a computer, it's Google Drive, um, there's no IT department, there's nothing's formal about it. It's very much like I would use my cell phone for business calls sometimes. Um, so it was just a very different feel. And it was a very much like there was no one to train me. It was a brand new role. So there, I didn't have a direct trainer. And it was something that, again, I've never done customer success. I didn't even know that was a field. So I did have to learn a lot. I went to conferences virtually. I bought books. I was sent books by my CEO. We also had some formalized training as a leadership team through something called Entrepreneurial Operating System. And that program is very, it gives a lot of guidance in terms of how a company prioritizes things. And so that was the company ethos. So you basically had a standard template as to how you ran your meetings, particularly leadership, but even with your team. And so you always had to follow that structure. And there was allotted time, there was a timekeeper. So things in terms of just the way things operated were very interesting for me to observe. Um, I think that over time in that role, I learned a ton. But I also think that I lost my identity as a genetic counselor. Um, because in tech world, there was that company, there was like awareness of genetic counselors, but not a huge focus on them for sure. And anytime you're in a business, you have to focus both on the customer base, but also on the shareholders. And that dictates like a lot of decision making, as does thoughts about like how you're going to grow next. Like, how are we going to grow? How are we going to meet the shareholder expectation? The board of directors mandates a lot of action. So I think that I realized over time, like, there's all these competing priorities. And so my job as focusing on the customer, I would want certain things like implemented, but due to the company strategy, sometimes that has to be a back burner. So over time, I just felt that I wasn't able to make the kind of change that I wanted to see in terms of like understanding the customer, serving the customer, marketing the product in a way that the customer, it was appealing, pricing it the way that would be appealing. I also realized again that companies are structured so that like the marketing department plans the webinars. So it doesn't matter if the audience is a group of genetic counselors and I've given talks to genetic counselors, the marketing department owns that and I'm a speaker. So I don't have as much say in certain things like that. And so I just realized over time, like again, culturally, tech was very different in terms of like a more combative environment. Like you've got to remember they're innovating all the time. They've got to rapidly innovate. They're very much thinking, strategic. And so I felt a little out of place as a true like empath or like social person seeking that type of connectedness at work. Wanting to, bond with my colleagues where that wasn't, they were just so busy. They worked all the time. And so I just started to feel like a value misalignment and kind of a loss of my own identity. Um, and really, to be honest, I started to get depressed. And so I actually, to make my decision, I really didn't necessarily want to leave, but I ended up seeking guidance from some old friends and colleagues that happened to be at my prior children's hospital. And they knew me really well. And so I sought them out to give me advice, like, how should I navigate this situation? Then also a career coach was recommended to me. So I sought career coaching. And what that career coach did is a lot of things like strength finders or personality assessments, or making me reflect around top achievements in my career. And as we went through those activities, she would state back to me, like, what drove me, what, as a person, like, what did I need? And it became crystal clear that what I needed was interpersonal engagement. I needed to have emotional exchange with people. I needed to be in an environment where, I was constantly innovating, challenged, not doing repetitive things. But more importantly, like, I had to see the value. I had to feel like I was making an impact. I had to touch people's lives. So for me, at the end of the day, it was that realization that led me to leave industry. I will say that it was a hard decision because I had been given the gift of time. I had more time with my family in industry. I made a better income. I felt that my growth trajectory was, you know, faster, higher, more potential quickly. And that was something I had to decide. So upon my soul searching, I went back to my advisor at the children's hospital. And in the course of her giving me advice, she ended up saying that people were desiring me to come back. At first, I kind of rolled my eyes and I thought that's a terrible idea. I left for a lot of reasons, but this job was in the Genomics Institute and not in my clinical role. So it was with a different supervisory team. And so I kind of thought about it and I ended up agreeing to put a proposal together with them. So they outlined their vision, their strategic plan, where they wanted to go, and then they outlined how they thought I could fit into that. And I came back with similar information where I said, here's what I know I bring to the table. Here's what I want my job to look like. Here's my strengths. Here's how I excel. And this is how I want to function. I also defined my parameters to come back. So I was not willing to take anything less than a director role since I had been operating at a director level. I proposed that to them. I proposed a starting salary that would be adequate, although recognizing that in academia and hospitals, the salary is lower. So I knew that I may have to make some accommodations. And then I very clearly, with the help of my coach, articulated my boundaries. One being that I needed a hybrid work schedule where I could work on site 3 days a week and from home 2 days a week. And luckily, with changes with COVID, that was more acceptable. So after a couple of months, we did come to an agreement. I re-interviewed for a newly created role, and I was welcomed back to my children's hospital institution. I've been back for about 2 years, so 1 year, 9 months, and I lead a team of research coordinators, genetic counselors, data scientists, and we are implementing translational protocols. So basically bench to bedside research where we do interface with patients. I do some of that, but largely I'm in an oversight role. So I manage the team that is interacting directly with patients. But what I get out of it is I see the direct impact on patients. I've been able to reconnect with some of my old patients. More importantly, I've got my friendships and my support system with colleagues who care and have similar values to mine. I do have my identity back as a genetic counselor. I feel like I'm doing what I love. Um, and ultimately, at the end of the day, even my kids said, like, Mom, we just want to see you happy. I think they knew that, like, industry was just not fitting me the way academic and hospital life did, because they saw in me that a gap was not being filled. So I would encourage you, as you make your decisions moving forward, to know that there is no right and wrong path. A lot of paths are not straight, they deviate. You can always change your mind. You may need to try things. I definitely am glad I tried industry because I always would have wondered. And I did it. Now, for me, that book is likely closed. I won't say never, but I think I learned about myself, what drives me and my motivations. And there's nothing wrong with having different motivations. Many people are very happy in their choice to go to industry. So, and each work environment's different. That's my other take home is that like, don't assume my experience will apply. Um, Everyone has their own journey, but I hope that you do some introspection, evaluation, and I encourage you to do anything you can do to explore what really makes you tick. I also explore you to pursue research, supports whatever possible, like coaching, to help you really define the best path for you. So that's all I got. Thank you guys so much, and good luck with your career journeys.